We are starting our discussion today. In fact, we are going to have two discussions on the subject of translation. Generally, this initiative is called a Two-Way Street, Ukrainian translation over the past 20 years. And those two discussions that we kindly offer you, that are taking place in the framework of the project Book Platform, which is actually organizing Next Page, and it's supported by East Culture and European Union. Today we have partners Book Forum, Goethe Institute, and Creative Union of Translators and Writers, the Foundation of Calvaria and Foundation of Yatsenyuk Open Ukraine. Today we will be talking about the problems of translation from different perspectives, from different viewpoints. Today we have very interesting people on the panel. These are book publishers, donors, writers, translators. So I'd like to present our panelists. This is Yana Genova, who is the head of Foundation Next Page, who is actually which is in the framework of International Project Book Platform, and she represents interesting international organizations, and she works on the subject of translation related to Eastern Europe and other countries. Konstantin Rodik, who is the president of International Rate Book of the Year, and he is the scientist, representative of the National Academy of Science. Konstantin actually made a research which will be the focus of our today's discussion. This is research on translations into Ukrainian over the past 20 years. We will definitely mention this research. Also, we are expecting Mr. Yevhen Bystritsky from International Renaissance Foundation. This is the institution that made great impact on the support of book publishing of Ukraine. Mr. Bodun, who is from Kyiv, Eva Wojciechowska, who is from representative from the Institute of Polish Books, and today we will also mention Polish experience, and Nelia Wachowska, who is a translator, editor, and the head of the board of directors of an institution which is called Creative Union of Translators and Writers, and Metro Drozdowski, the translator, philosophy doctor of linguistics, scientist who represents the Academy of Literature of Ukraine, and the chief editor of the magazine Всесвіт, journal Всесвіт. So we have quite an interesting circle of panelists. There are translators, donors, scientists, researchers. Today I'd like to start with the introduction of Yana Genova, who will give us the overview of the project Book Platform, what they do, and what is the main purpose of the objective of this project.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at the 20th anniversary of the forum. Actually, the Book Platform project is not a project of the foundation that I'm working with. It's a collaboration in Ukraine with the publishers from Uzi. And there are two other countries involved in our work, Armenia and Georgia, and I'll tell you why. We're here to talk about translations today, but before doing this, I want to give you a very quick overview of the Book Platform project, and perhaps every one of you in this room will find his or her place in the project, and how can you benefit from it. Although we are already in our second year of implementation, so if you didn't get to know about the project yet, I hope you'll find your place in it. The Book Platform is rather a very multifaceted program aiming at the development of the book sectors in Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine. As Volodya said, it's being supported by the European Union program called Euro-East, which I recommend everybody in the culture sector here to take a look at and perhaps use some of the opportunities that they are providing, including financial ones. Because it's unique for the European Union to basically give money for culture, especially in countries outside of the European Union. So please use it as much as you can. The book platform project has 3 topics, and perhaps our aims can be summarized in 3 points as well. We are interested in publishing as an industry, as a cultural industry. The project is also working on the theme of translations both into the languages of the project and from the languages of the project. And reading is our 3rd topic. Now I have to say, this is not a program that gives money for titles to be published, to my deepest regret. We cannot do that. It's not a program that gives money for new bookshops to be opened, to my deepest regret as well. It's rather a program that tries to support sustainable, long-term changes in the infrastructure of the way the book sector operates. And we modestly do that by trying to provide what I call the armitory. I don't know if it's the correct expression in English. We're trying to support the players in the book sector itself to help themselves, so to speak. The project believes that to do so, we need at least 3 things. We need to know where we stand, because in culture usually there are a lot of mythologies around. Everybody thinks they know how culture operates. They know who are the best writers, or they know why certain books get published and others do not. But the book platform project, we believe it's good to have some data and some more stable ground to base our future strategies on, and that's why we do studies like this, which are the subject of today's discussion. The second thing we try to help with is providing skills to publishers mainly, but also to cultural organizations dealing with books and readings. And the third thing we try to help is, we think it's important to know who your partners are, could be, who your allies or even your enemies could be. And that's why we are providing support to Ukraine, Armenia and Georgia in their international business and professional contacts, in finding allies and partners abroad. I'll very quickly go through the activities now, what we do using this thing. So, on the subject of skills, European Union calls it increased capacity. So, we have trainings on subjects like copyrights, or how to set up a translators association, or how to promote your literature abroad. By the way, you can get this thing in paper format in Ukrainian over there. So if anybody wants, Ira is holding that. We have a distant learning and distant coaching scheme. So you can find, if you have a colleague abroad with whom you want to work on the same project, we can facilitate this pairing, and we pay to your international colleague to help you with your concrete project, if they can do that, of course. And we have a series of internships on the subjects like promotion of reading and promotion of translations abroad. As I said, we're trying to do a lot about supporting international exchange. As Edward Nabokka was saying today, the world of publishing is getting more and more international, so it's impossible to stay within the national boundaries any longer. one of the things we are doing, we are actually financing the editorial visits that are taking place now. So some of our guests are here in the room, bringing international publishers, journalists, cultural organizations to Lviv. And I hope this will lead to future business and non-business contacts as well. We will be supporting the participation of not everybody in this room, but perhaps some people with innovative ideas, like writers, translators, publishers, literary agents. We'll be supporting their participation in events in the European Union. On the subject of getting to know where our book sector is, we are supporting a series of studies, and these translation studies are part of the series. We are also, we'll be holding so-called policy discussions, and this is one of them. We'll be holding public debates, and this is one of them. But for policy discussions, I don't know whether we have the person from the Ministry of Culture that we've been expecting, so that we can turn that into a policy discussion as well. And our website is quite rich, if I can humbly say so. It's quite rich on resources. Everything we do, everything we produce is available in 4 to 5 languages, including Ukrainian and English, on the website. But you can also find links to your potential allies, your potential partners abroad. Everything we do in terms of training is also available on the website. Now, this is a project that started a year and a half ago. A year and a half before, or a year before, your president had issued the Decree 336. The spirit of the decree is very similar to the spirit of our project, but we have already done a lot of concrete work. So it's, I think it's up to the future to see whether this important presidential document will have any concrete follow-ups as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Щиро дякую, Яно. Now we are moving on to the content of the research and studies which was made by Konstantin Rodik, having huge experience of managing the project Book of the Year and observing the dynamics of Ukrainian translators from the early independence years of Ukraine and up to today. So, Mr. Rodik, welcome. Прошу сказати, що не працює мікрофон. First of all, I welcome everyone here and I wish everyone fruitful discussion and fruitful book forum. Words, as it is known, every study is an adventure. It's an adventure with all the outcomes. That could be a suspense, that could be something unexpected. Every professional most likely knows this feeling and is familiar with the feeling when you start making a research of something that seemed to have been known to you, and you just have to systematize your own knowledge about it and put it on paper using comprehensive language. Here you come across the fact because you move forward, you move deeper, and sometimes you have different thoughts. For example, my first thought was, Very often we have people who write PhD on book publishing, on book knowledge, and majority of those dissertations and texts, this is just accumulation of different facts. They do not provide to an average person an understanding why. Why is this done today? After all, I thought how to do this research so that it is interesting not only to the narrow circle of professionals and specialists, but to a broader public. Because by job I'm a journalist, more of a journalist than a scientist, I wanted to see it with the eyes of an average person. So when I thought that way, I understood that the most interesting knowledge about what books were translated, how many books were translated, when they were translated, it would be to realize and understand how those books affected social theories, how they affected changes of mentality. And I understood quite soon that such study, such research, it's a long-term strategy for me. And as of today, we don't have the necessary base for this. For example, Benjamin, who published a book. Actually, we published his book twice. He's a philosopher, and we were trying to understand how he affected something, how it is reflected in some discourse. We wanted to know how many books actually reached the audience. Unfortunately, we don't have the system of statistics of book selling. We don't have it at all. So the statistics that, for example, Western countries have, so they know how many books were sold, but because normally books are sold through bookstore chains, we don't have the statistics. The book would be published like 1 million copies or 1,000 copies, but because the booksellers don't know how to sell it, it can collect dust in the warehouse and then it can turn into scrap paper, and a well-known name that became well-known because of Ukrainian translators was actually neglected. So if we could know how many copies of each book were sold and reached the audience, then we could analyze how it affected the reader, and then we could include it into discussion of different humanitarian problems. But this is my distant thought. Even during my research, I bumped into the problem that not only we have no statistics of book publishing, but also many publishers do not note the circulation. They don't know what is the book circulation. Also, this function sometimes is given over to book chamber. And the first tool, the first instrument I had was the reports of book chamber about the publishing of translations over the last 20 years. So there was a full list, and there was a list of languages, and so on. Seemed this research shouldn't have taken much of my time having all this, but when I started verifying this data, I found some discrepancies. I understood that I cannot base my research on this information because book chamber works as a registrator, as a register. They just work like bookkeepers, like accountants. So the book has been published and they put it into a record. So among the functions of book chamber, actually there is no tracking the book in the book marking, and this is a huge problem. Also, there was a research of the president of Association of Translators, and there he said that 25% of books are not tracked. So you can imagine that this is huge amount of books which are not tracked. And some books are those that could have become an event, that could have been, for example, the winners in book forum could have become the book of the year. But in governmental statistics, they are virtually non-present. Also, I hit different statistics that I had to calculate manually some of the things, because the program was too sophisticated, and sometimes I had to really do such monotonous and manual work. And up till today, I can't understand where these figures come from in these general statistics. For example, they say that in 2011, I apologize, they say that in 2011 they published around 800 translations, and the list of the books contains only 600 items. So such discrepancy, which sometimes equals 40%, actually is present in all years. That's why I had to do this work of actually which had to be done by book chamber. So I had to do it, this calculation, this manual calculation. What I did, actually, I am responsible. This is my liability as a researcher when I present statistics and the figures. Why book chamber doesn't do it, or why they do it, it's hard to say. Nevertheless, I also faced another thing, another issue. I thought that this period, which actually passed so quickly, that's 20 years of editor's activity, is quite renowned period. But it turned out that we don't have the history of book publishing in Ukraine over the past years. We can mention maybe 3 books. One, this is the book of Alexander Afonin, but this is not the history of book publishing, but the history of association which he leads. Another book is of Professor Mykola Tymoshek. Again, it touches some of the problems, refers to some of the problems, but it doesn't cover the history of book publishing. And also, I cannot mention the book of Vasil Teremok. So this is the head of the editing house, publishing house Academy. And it also relates mostly to trade aspects rather than the history of book publishing in Ukraine. In order to get more or less reliable results about translations, I couldn't bypass the history of Ukrainian book publishing, because it has its own specific character and peculiarity which affects the translations into Ukrainian, translations from Ukrainian into other languages. And this fact is actually the omnipresence of Russian books in our market, and such confrontation, during such confrontation, the work of Ukrainian translators was done. In early 90s, 1992-93, up till today, there were very few translations, and even you can see it in those brochures. And Dmytro, who is the chief editor of Всесвіт journal, he actually also brought such a journal, and you can see that in early 90s there were very, very few translations. Then comes 1992-93, and the International Renaissance Foundation works in Ukraine, which helps solve the problem a little bit. Up until early 90s, Renaissance Foundation was a monopolist, which motivated and stimulated publishing of translated literature. Another major problem which I faced working in this survey is what could be considered a translation in general. So the same book chamber keeps register of everything that has been translated. It could be it could be any manual, it could be any brochure, flyer, whatever, for example, for secondary school children. Could that be considered a translation? In official statistics, it's considered as an item of translation, same as the translation of Benjamin. Is this a norm? Should we take it into account as a translation? For example, a brochure, house and landscape design, or recommendations on gardening or keeping chicken, yes, in household farm. But this all is actually registered in statistics as an item of translation. And there are so many translations that it seems that Ukraine is a very solid translation country, which actually is on a constant standby. From another viewpoint, we have very distorted statistics of translation from Russian, because those instructions, those manuals, those guidance, which book chamber considers as translation items, they are mostly from Russian. Maybe it's easier for a publisher to pay to a translator there in Russia rather than find a translator here in Ukrainian. Is there a translation of the instruction how to exploit translators and interpreters? Is there anything like that? And taking into account this type of literature, Book Chamber affirms and asserts that if you take, for example, translations from English as 100%, then 50% would constitute translations from Russian. So Russian takes second language, taking into account these statistics. I cannot remember all the figures. You can look them up in this brochure. We have 16% of all books translated from Russian. And as for other countries, let's say Central Europe, Mid-Europe, so you can look up at the site of Book Platform and those studies that had been made before. There they show how things are done in Poland and Hungary and other countries. Then we are more or less in the same stream. So the first place is taken by English, second Russian, this is Ukrainian specific, and then French, then German, and then the fifth place is taken by Polish language. Then Italian, Spanish, and among Eastern languages we only have Japanese.
I don't know how much time I have taken. I will try to be brief, and I will come to a conclusion. Then we'll have a kind of discussion. So, what is the situation like? Now, in my view, is now getting better, slowly but steadily. We mentioned the question, what should be considered translation. I can see the director of Baltia Druk publishing house. They published a Hotin Battle book last year, which won a Grand Prix. 1/3 of it is translation from Lithuanian, but it was published as an original book, and there are many such books. So we have to work together with professionals to introduce this term as the term translation. So in my view, the situation is getting better, but nevertheless, I would like you to pay attention to these numbers, figures. Without the state of different foundations, the Renaissance Foundation, other foreign programs by foreign embassies, we have only more than 5% of humanitarian literature is published. The rest is something sponsored by foreign partners. In terms of fiction, the situation looks a little bit better. In my view, I think 20% of books are published by publishers, but still 80% is funded by foreign funds, foundations. it would be better if you formulate some questions for me. Maybe these questions could be addressed to me or to somebody else. I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Konstantin. First, I would like to hear all our speakers today, and then I hope we will have a discussion. I would like to give the floor to Yevhen Bystritsky, because Konstantin has already mentioned the Renaissance Foundation, which has done a lot for the Ukrainian translation process, not only as an institution supporting publishing, but also as an institution which supported translations in different spheres. So, okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Jana for coming here, Konstantin also, and Yaroslav, Volodymyr, all the others, without whom systemic policy of translation would not have taken place in Ukraine. I would like to say something about my foundation. It has happened that I'm sitting on two chairs. One is the director of foundation, and also I'm the chairman of the philosophy department. For me, therefore, the translation business is very organic. When we had our program which was closed by our society, I talked to Soros and I said, okay, give me a few years. He said, I'll give you some money for translation. 4 or 5 years later, he came to Ukraine and he said, what's next? I said, 1 more year or maybe 2 more years, and our government and our intellectual community will unfold. Just give us a few more years, some more time. 2 or 3 years later, he comes back. It was 2005, after the Orange Revolution. So he said 2 years. What's next? I said, you see, we have political transformations, so 2 more years. Then next, I met him in New York. He said, I remember that you would close this program because it's been for 10 years. And I had no arguments to continue. Because how long can Soros support our need for translation? He did all he could. Now you have these brochures. Just pass them around. This is an old brochure. It contains 600 names of translations. Look at the names of the titles. Look at the translations supported by the Renaissance Foundation. 600 names. Now 667 or even 8 translations because they were published a bit later. All the antique literature. If your fate named Nietzsche, you could fit it in one bookcase. But so there are more than 600 titles by best authors in business, macroeconomics, history, philosophy, psychology, political science, and on and on. Have a look at these names, titles. This is a prehistory, forward. First of all, I would like to thank those who cooperated with us. We were not alone supporting this translation program. I would like to open our colleagues from Open Society in different institutions, from the German Embassy, Goethe Institute, the Polish Cultural Center. We took money from the French, from wherever possible. Now, I would like to give you a bit theory. I'm not excited, I'm not worried, I'm not nervous. But the first book about aeronautics was written by me. I was studying in Moscow at the time, but I published it in Ukraine. It is about hermeneutics. And it also talks about the miserable state of translation. I'm not talking about this. I would like to talk about why translation. What does it give us? First of all, people think that if we translate Kant into Ukraine, or Hegel into Ukraine, or Heidegger, or Habermas, if we translate all this into Ukrainian, everything will be clear. No. In order to understand, you have to ensure that the fire of understanding starts burning in our cultural and linguistic soil. the most difficult thing in translation is to find a person who would be able to translate, to do the translation, adequate, and understand what's. A simple example: when we started this translation program, we supported a book. It's a very vivid example. It's a book devoted to public policy research. What is policy? We can translate it as state policy, because he's talking about the Ukrainian translation of this word. It's about strategies worked out by consensus, and the author translated both politics and policy is one word. When I opened this book, I remember how glad I was to see this book. When I began to read it, there is translation, but it's impossible to understand it. It's nonsense. It's a simple example. Recently my wife showed me a thesis in philosophy. It was on the topic. They translated from Russian. It was automatically translated from Russian. It's sexual relations. In Russian the word sexual is pol, the same as floor in Ukrainian. It's the same word in Ukrainian. So the computer translated the word sexual as floor. Yesterday I was shown a stall, Trinity Meridian. They gave me a book. They were my friends. We sat over coffee and I looked through the book, and they mentioned Celan and Max Frisch. I wondered why Paul Celan. Of course, you can see, you can have a look. So, in a nutshell, I don't remember who translated that book, but there was a translation problem. Translators are like glasses. You see better through them, but you forget that they exist. So I would like to raise the question mentioned by Konstantin. It's about support for translation. Everybody thinks that translation is automatic. What's the problem? If translate Max Frisch or Paul Celan, easy thing, somebody may think. Those who think so do not understand the goal of the translator. His aim is to be a bridge between cultures. This person should be able to understand. It's a fantastic, serious, spiritual workload on the person. Payment for his work is almost zero. I know. I remember how we try to find the funds and for translation. I once raised this question at the Philosophy Institute. If a person translated a famous philosopher, a good book, he should be granted the PhD title. It doesn't work, of course. Nobody understands that this is it's much better to translate something high quality than to publish some nonsense. Therefore, the importance and the insistence on the importance of translation and the importance for civil society to mobilize oneself and insist on having a consistent state policy in the sphere of translation is a task not number two, it's number one task. If we are to have normal humanitarian policy and a normal European identity, we have to do it. I could talk a lot about about translation in this sphere. I know. So there are some translations. One piece of work by Benjamin, one by Kant, and what? If philosophical diction was translated from French, it's a colossal piece of work. But if they mentioned some strong points, and if they understood the system of entering, joining the European culture. It's a huge issue. Can't even talk about that. So we can talk about state funds. Here on my computer I have some the analysis of the funds allocated by the government, by the state. 32 million per year. Only 32 million per year. It's horrible. It's $4 million. If we had 4 million, we could translate half of Europe. Half Europe. This process. So I looked at how it's distributed. Not bad books by Ukrainian authors, but some amounts are allocated for translation, not only for books by academicians or famous politicians, but there is no system. There is no independent systemic identification of where to allocate, to allocate the money on. It's all closed. We don't know how to do it, what to do. Again, is the task. The aim is to have this, to make sure that this policy is open, transparent. We have to affect this process. There should be some bodies or councils or independent councils that they would be able to identify what to do. It's difficult to do it in Ukrainian conditions because we are a corrupt state. To support this too. All this system should be transparent and clear to society. It should be discussed. And here we face a simple thing again. The translation business connected with the democratization and openness of society. We have these issues, these problems, we have to solve them together. Thank you. I suggest that we put off this discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Evhan. Now, I would like to give the floor our Polish colleague, Jaroslav Godin, the director of the Polish Institute in Kiev, and Ewa Wojciechowska, the representative of the Book Institute in Poland. Good afternoon. Since our discussion, my discussion and Eva's discussion will probably not coincide with the main topic, but I don't want to impose anything, because the Polish Institute is an establishment of the Foreign Ministry, and the Institute of Books, the Book Institute, working in Krakow and Warsaw, is funded by the Ministry of Culture. But I would like to talk about something different. There is some noise, background noise. Okay, thank you. No. It's a provocation. Oh, provocation. Don't worry, don't worry. Okay. I wanted to read from BlackBerry because I don't have information. In brief, here, this year, the Polish Institute has prepared the information about anthology of translation from Polish in Ukraine. I wanted to call them a translation from Polish into Ukraine, but it turned out later that it would be not correct, because some translations which were done, or the books which were published in Ukraine, were in Russian. I'm talking about the early 90s. We analyzed the years 1991 to 2003. What's your name? Excuse me. Konstantin. We tried to find everything which we could. Of course, it was very difficult. We found more than 460 books over this period. We tried to go Vernadsky Library, and it was possible, but we had a problem with the library of the Parliamentary Library. Yes, Parliamentary Library. It was we couldn't enter this library because it's a closed establishment, institution, but it's one of the libraries where each book, each copy, or the copy of each book should be sent. I thought we could check there, but we failed. But I would like to talk about something different. Uh, so we have to talk about copyright, but it's a different thing again. We found more than 460 books published here in Ukraine, and it's a nice thing what Eugene said. If without translators there would be no translations. These publishing houses, more than 200 Ukrainian publishers from all over Ukraine. They publish books in both Ukrainian and Russian. Most translations are in Ukrainian. There were more than 150 translators. I was very surprised. I couldn't even believe that it could be so many. Half of these books found here are fiction, and of course it includes philosophy, history, Polish-Ukrainian relations, history, and a lot of philosophical literature. But what we found in the last few years also was religious literature translated into from Polish into Ukrainian. Yevhen also mentioned that the Renaissance Foundation supported some things. We had a joint program with this foundation until it was closed by Soros in 2010. And this program was developing very well. Over this time, we published over 50 books. I would like to emphasize one thing. At the beginning of the 1990s, I don't want to go back to Adam and Eve. I just wanted to go back to the beginnings of Ukraine. The Polish Institute began its work in 1999. From 1991 to 1999, there were about 50 to 60 books. In 2012, in 1 year alone, there were over 60 books. In 1 year alone, last year. So how did it develop? In 7 years, fewer books were published than in 1 year alone. I talked to Jana, and we mentioned that more books from Polish are published into Ukrainian. In terms of translation, there is a book institute. I would like Eva to say a few words about this. I would like to talk about decentralization in Poland, which occurred in 2000, because this decentralization had a big effect on the development of culture and society and education, because in 2004 the Book Institute was created in Poland, which only deals with popularization of and helps translate Polish books into other languages. Ukrainian is one of those languages. Is the third most important language funded by this institute. So German, Russian, and then Ukrainian. So the third biggest language. In this context, I already mentioned that, about this Book Institute and the Institute of Cinematography, the Dance Institute, and the Institute of Music Institute and Music and Dance Institute. There are 6 institutes which deal with one thing, with one trend, and the Book Institute popularizes translation and funds translation and gives a huge impetus to Polish books being published in other languages. The Polish Institute is an establishment funded by the Foreign Ministry, but we also finance these books. We fund translations. The paradox is about the fact that we can't pay for the book printing of books. It's a paradox. That's how our financial law is created. We can only pay for the translation and for copyright. As far as printing of books is concerned, we can't fund it. And of course translators receive zero money, because I was also on these different panels, and I know that translation of a strong text costs, or may cost 15 euros, and it should be given to a translator. Maybe but only 3 euros is received by the translator himself. Everybody wants to see this book published, and everybody understands that these books are published. Of course, every publishing house wants to make some money, but the idea is to make sure that this humanitarian matter in Ukrainian is at the highest level possible. That's what I wanted to say. I just mentioned the anthology of translation from Polish. You can see this file. You can open this file in a PDF on our website. There are 200 pages. There is an index. We wanted to find all the information and publish it there. The information for this 12 years. We also wanted to show it like as Eugene did. So unfortunately we failed, but we will publish it a bit later. You can download it from our web page. I'm giving the floor to Eva Wojciechowska, because this year Poland is an honorary guest at this forum, and it has a special stand. But you can also find very useful information about programs run by the Book Institute, and about this funds which could be of interest to you if you want, funds for translation into Ukrainian. And to conclude, Poles also want to translate from Ukrainian into Polish. There was a time when Open Ukraine funded something, but now it's over. There are a few publishing houses, Charna, which published Andruchowicz, when he was not a patriarch of Ukrainian literature yet. He wasn't called patriarch at that time yet, but he was already published in Polish. Natalka Snidanko and Zabushko were published, and Prohaska was also published in Polish. But of course, there could have been more such books translated if we knew who to address, who to talk to. Very often Polish publishing houses ask me, who could we talk to in order to find the answer. Unfortunately, I don't know this answer, because there was a time when something was moving forward. There are no state programs now, and these non-state programs are unstable. And I think that this tendency for translation from Ukrainian into other languages could be more dynamic, and it could positively affect the image of Ukraine abroad. It's undoubtedly. Translation is a very good image of a country abroad. There is no doubt. There is an author, and there is his or her book, and the author it can be passed on from one person to another and can be read by many people. Дякую за те, що мене запросили. Я представляю Інститут книги. Будь ласка, хай мікрофон ближче. Окей.
As Mr. Goto said, I represent the Polish Book Institute, Instytut Książki, which is a governmental institution that promotes Polish literature abroad. So I will give you a picture of how this promotion of Polish literature and supporting Polish books abroad is done in Poland. So first of all, we inform about what we have. So we prepare materials for foreign publishers, agents and translators about newest, most interesting books published in Poland within the last year or few months. We prepare special issues of the new books from Polish magazine in English, German, and once a year in French. We distribute these catalogs on book fairs and Polish stands. We are present at the most important book fairs in Europe. We send these catalogs to literary agencies, to translators, and to publishers as well. We are trying to focus on people that we are trying to reach those people who will for whom these materials would be useful. So we are trying to reach editors in foreign publishing houses. So first of all, we inform people, publishers, translators, and literary agents abroad what we have to offer. Then we try to support financially support those who found something interesting. So we have two basic programs that support translations. One of them, the more important one, is called Copyright Follow Translation Program, and this is a program addressed to foreign publishers. So once the publisher has decided, I would like to publish this book, so he or she can get sends us an application and can get 100% of the translation and license cost. So as Mr. Gordon said, we have a problem that we can support the same, but it's a question of how it's specific of Polish law. So to speak. We also have a smaller program that supports translators. So of course it's ideal situation if a publisher already decides, I want this book, I want this author. So, but it's very often, maybe of course everyone knows that translators are those who usually convince foreign publishers to take this particular book. So we also finance sample translations. So we offer money for the translators. We pay them for a translation of samples, 20 pages of a particular book. And it's working really good. So it encourages translators to work more, to find books, to look for books, to once they have some support, they know that there is a chance that a publisher will be. Sorry. We also run study visits for translators and for foreign publishers. Once a year we invite a group of about 30 publishers from different countries. We invite them to Krakow for 3 days. They meet Polish publishers and literary critics. So they can learn about what's going on in Polish literature. And once in 4 years we organize a big event for translators. It's called the World Congress for Translators of Polish Literature. This year in June we had the third edition of this congress. So we hosted around 200 translators of Polish literature from all the world. It's a huge event. It costs a lot of money, so we can't do it more often than once in 4 years. But we can see that after such an event, the number of applications that come to the Copyright Poland Translation Program is really growing. The Copyright Poland Translation Program has a fixed budget of 1 million zlotys. It's about 250,000 euros. But our problem is that the budget is the same since 7 years actually. It's not enough. Because we started with around 10 years ago. The program has 13 years, but it has a regular fixed form for about 10 years. And we started with around 30, 50 applications per year. Now we get around 200. And it's a very tough decision for us. How to, we are fighting for more money in the Ministry of Culture, but now it's just not a good moment. There is no money. We've had budget cuts. So we are at the moment in a very difficult we have a difficult decision to make, because we always have been trying to do our best and to support everyone, and we were trying to be very flexible. We also so we support not only high quality fiction, we tried to support also crime stories or bestsellers in countries where there is nothing translated of Polish literature. So, for example, we wouldn't support Katarzyna Grochola in Russia or Ukraine, but we would support her books we did support her books in Vietnam, where there was nothing. Now it's because the program is growing, so we get more and more applications. The budget is still fixed. We are now in a difficult moment. We simply have to decide where to stop, and should we still support bestsellers or not. We will have to think about it simply. But as Mr. Godot also said, Ukraine is one of the top, Ukrainian language is one of the top languages that Polish literature is translated into. It also depends on how you count it, because, well, the top 5 languages are German, Russian, Czech, Hungarian and Ukrainian. But in the last 5 years, I would say that Ukrainian translations we have more and more Ukrainian translations. So it depends on how you count it. If you look at the last 10 years, we could say that in the early 2000, between 2000 and 2005, we had more Russian and German translation, but since 2004 we have more and more Ukrainian translation, so it's actually top language if we speak about translation.
Дякую дуже, пані Ево, дякую дуже, пане Ярославе.
Thank you very much, Yaroslav. Thank you very much to our Polish participants. They have to leave now, unfortunately, because they have another event. But they have a very interesting experience of supporting translations in other countries. I'm really happy that we actually related to the subject of translators as the subject of translation, because very often we talk about book publishing, about translations, about financial support, and very often we forget about people who stand behind this. There is even the practice when translators are not even mentioned in the book. And now I'd like to give the floor over to Nelia Wachowska, who is one of the very active participants of this process. So she is a translator. That's why she's trying to popularize the role of translators, and she's the head of Creative Union of Translators and Writers. So Nelia, over to you. Thank you very much. I'd like to briefly mention the following things, what Konstantin actually mentioned. What is a translation and what is the definition of translation? Because in public discussion we talk about translation, and translation is the field which has lots of interpretations. It's a process. It's a process which is ongoing process, and there are certain people involved into this process, and those people bear responsibility for this process. And translation in the book market is a production of a book, and people responsible for the book cannot only be translators who are mentioned or sometimes not even mentioned in the outcomes of the book. My viewpoint is that Ukraine has really poor practice talking about translation, about literature in very idealistic colors. Translation is the sphere of preserving the language, values, traditional values, conserving something. All these are blah blah good words, but very often this becomes some kind of ideological excuse and hiding real facts of hardship of a translator. It's not a secret that there are some publishing houses which actually neglect the work of translator. And no translation is good if no good interpreter, no good editor is involved. If there is no good correction, no scientific editing and other things, if those people are not involved into translation, if those subjects of translators are not there, so then translation cannot be considered good quality. If those subjects are not involved, then the end result of the product will be poor. Very often we have a situation that the book was published, unfortunately it doesn't meet the demands of the customers, it doesn't satisfy the demands of the customer, and traditionally the translator is considered to be poor translator. But sometimes we fail to mention that this is the result of the whole team, the team of editors. Sometimes they forget that they are there to be responsible for this translation as well. And they should be conscientious representative of their responsibility. I don't want to claim only translators responsible for all this, but I believe that the problem is complex, and sometimes we fail to mention other subjects and other participants. I didn't like really the idea of tolerance from the side of foundations, especially to the practice of cutting the grants and splitting the grants among translators, because having some legal basis and legal norms, and in Ukraine supports supports only the idea that translators should be given a fee. We also have to remember that there should be money allocated to publishing the book, because everywhere in the world the translation of fiction is not the sphere where you can make good money. Normally translators are underpaid. Even in such markets as France and Germany, the fee the translator gets is really minimum. Sometimes the translator translates complicated things. I'm not talking about bestsellers or light reading. I'm talking about serious things. That's why the practice of being tolerant to cutting the budget or splitting this fee among different players, I think this is the wrong practice. We cannot ensure good quality of translation as a product unless we pay good money to translators and other subjects. Another thing I want to mention is translation as a dialogue, something that has already been mentioned. I believe that there is a law. The more we translate from other languages, the more we become open to other countries. Unfortunately, there is no discussion, no public discussion. If there are any discussions, they are very few, and they are around the subject that we have to export Ukrainian literature to the West or somehow popularize Ukrainian literature. But unfortunately, we lack vision of the whole process of translation. And I believe that today's discussion will promote the forming this general vision of translation process as it is. Thank you, Nelia. And I believe it's a really good thing that you mentioned this polyprofessionalism of a translator. So translator should be really good professional in literal style, in scientific understanding when we talk about scientific literature. Yevhen mentioned Renaissance Foundation. I'd like to remind you that there were so many educational initiatives supported by this foundation. That was the Laboratory of Scientific Translation, Translatorium, Lviv Translatorium, and there they were trying to combine different ways of translation, how to work with languages, how to understand the recipient language and target language, and how to understand conceptually the language of translation. Now I'd like to give the word over to Dmytro Drozdovsky, who is a kind of intermediate between old Ukrainian translation tradition and contemporary Ukrainian translation tradition, and he is the one who sees all those processes, those changes that Ukraine is undergoing. So Dmytro Drozdovsky is the chief editor of Всесвіт journal. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I had a few reflections that were born during this discussion, and I'd like to share them with you. I support Nela that translation is the product of production, and it's not the product of one person, a translator. I'll just give you one brief example from my experience, which we had recently, a few months ago, in Всесвіт journal. Let's say one of the most professional translators came up to us, Ivan Zuba, and he wanted to translate a novel of Nobel Award winner, and he asked us to publish maybe part of this novel, and maybe it will be the reason for promoting this novel. Maybe there later will be some money to publish this trilogy. This was his initiative, this was his idea, this was his, let's say, will. But behind this initiative there is institutional work. Moyane and his literally agents and the industry where he exists, they say yes, we are ready to publish it, 60 pages out of this trilogy, but provided it's paid accordingly, which would be 1,800 American dollars. This is the practice of contemporary Ukraine, and in order to publish this part of the novel, we had to accept the rules of this person, his literary agents, so that the publishing would be authorized, legal, and it should correspond to the demands of the contemporary market. That's why this thesis is very important, that the translation is the product of business and cultural production. Coming back to discussion of the study of Konstantin Rodek, I'd like to look at the part of the table. Here it says the 90s, the number of books published per person. In 1999 it's 0.36. I wanted to remind you that in the early 90s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Всесвіт journal had a tradition to print the word million readers. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was inflation, hyperinflation, and that was no longer the time to talk about translation, to talk about cultural aspects of life. The thing was about how to survive. Those trends were mentioned in the research of Konstantin Rodek, and I think that the study presented by Konstantin, it's historical study, it's panoramic, and it's systematic. And I'm grateful to Book Platform and to book publishers for their consent to publish this research in Всесвіт journal, because it's the first corresponding study of and research of the books which were made in Ukrainian translation with their own findings. There you can find some facts about the history of translation studies in 1991, when, for example, there were some periods where French translations dominated, about professional comments and details which are very, very important. I'd like to focus your attention to some problematic aspects which haven't been overlined yet, but which relate back to Konstantin Rodek's study. The first aspect, which has been outlined by the forms of institutional support of translation, which were mentioned by Konstantin. They are in Russia, but they are not here in Ukraine. This is zero taxation, which led to the boom of translation activity and book publishing in our neighboring country, Russia. Book publishers were tax exempt. In Ukraine, it's draconic taxation, I'd say. And this is one of the facts of translation project which either detains or accelerates the translation activity. The system of book selling. I believe that this is very important because in Ukraine, after the collapse of Soviet Union, the system, very successful system of dissemination of books in libraries was destroyed. Books were disseminated in big and small libraries, including village libraries, and readers could have access to books. Unfortunately, today we don't have this system of book distribution and book dissemination. That's why book publishing for publishing houses is also quite negative, because we don't have the forms of realization of books. We're not talking about mass books, about popular books, about the publishing houses which have some name, reputation, and PR in cultural environment. This could be compared to this negative dynamics of drops in book selling in Ukraine back to the 19th up to today. We are trying to overcome the crisis. Yevhen Bystritsky focused on philosophical aspect of translation. Translation as the phenomenal problem, and from translation, a lot depends on translation, because translation can have the function of anti-colonial, post-colonial. Translation could be done from a language, and the language could be direct, or a language as intermediate language in translation. And very often there are bad translations, poor translations from Russian. There are good translations. 2 years ago we had discussions in the circles of scientists and translators, and we mentioned that there are poor and good translations. But I also believe that translation is culture, because in Ukraine, which doesn't have the institutional form of support of translation, book publisher and bookseller, on different aspects, the citizen of Ukraine is social and economically non-protected. Ukraine is not Britain, Ukraine is not United States, where each person is fits into the system. The same could be compared to translation. We don't have the system of book publishing, the system of book book selling. We don't have tax exemption. We don't have tax privileges for Ukrainian book publishers. Focusing on research of Konstantin Rodek, I'd like to mention 3 items he mentioned. The rates that are presented by Book Chamber, which make makes it impossible to verify how many translations were published indeed, and here it refers to the ethics. Either publishers do not mention the circulation, the number of copies, or the number of copies is wrong. Also, there is no history of book publishing. We should analyze here objective criteria, sociological criteria, historical criteria. Without this information, we cannot move on to modern market conditions and build the book publishing system, which now is in post-stagnation, post-Soviet matrix, unfortunately. And to recap, I'd like to mention the translation of the works of Paul Garcia Marquez once wasn't paid his fee in the Soviet Union. He was deeply hurt, and he said that I'm not going to publish any book in any post-Soviet country unless you pay me the money. So that actually this claim was made in Moscow, and it has been quoted, and this offense actually blocked the access to this Nobel Prize winner. A few years ago, the project of Ivan Malkovich, Albaba Galamaga, actually thought of publishing Marquez, and they referred to the book publisher which has the copyright for publishing books of this author and other renowned authors. And in 2010, Russia paid the debts of Soviet publishing house, and they purchased the right to sell Marquez books in Ukrainian translation in the territory of Ukraine. 2 years passed, nothing has happened so far. Russia didn't publish Marquez books in Ukrainian translation as it was presumed in the agreement, but Ukrainian translators and Ukrainian book publishers unfortunately cannot have access to his books. And this is unfortunately the practice of contemporary world book publishing. Sometimes it leads to paradox with lack of possibilities for book publishing, translation, and other opportunities. Thank you very much, Dmitro. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Maybe our participants have questions to our